Welcome back to class 40 of the life of Christ. This is the second half of the story about the Transfiguration. We already set up the story itself and talked about the places where it might have happened and the reasons why we think that. And in this part of the class, we want to pick up several lessons that are really interesting about this story, connected to this story from both the Old and New Testaments. First of all, we want to talk about Luke 9, verse 31. If you remember, we read in the story about how Moses and Elijah appear, and then you have them speaking with Jesus. And verse 31 says, they spoke about his departure. And if you look at that word in Greek for departure, it's the word Exodus, which is, again, for a Jew, that would ring a lot of bells, and you wonder why he picked that particular word. Is there some connection with the story of Exodus about leaving Egypt? And so again, you have another example of how the life of Jesus could parallel the life of Israel in the Old Testament. And so you wonder if Luke is choosing that word to connect it to the Old Testament. Could it be he's suggesting that Jesus' Exodus is going to be from the slavery of this earth? In other words, he'll finally be free of the earth, the limitations that were on him as a human. That's a possibility. Or perhaps Moses and Elijah and Jesus are talking about a different kind of Exodus that would also help us get our Exodus out of sin, because Jesus is about to go to Jerusalem and offer himself, and that would free us from the slavery of sin. So again, it's an interesting word for Luke to pick that has undertones and overtones in the Old and New Testament. Then the next piece of the story that's interesting is what happens with Peter and the three shelters. It says they're very sleepy, but then they wake up and they see Jesus in glory and the two men standing with him. And I always kind of wondered how Peter knew who they were, because obviously he wasn't alive when they were alive on the earth, okay? And so he says, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up three shelters, one for you, for Moses, and for Elijah. And Luke kind of comically says he didn't know what he was saying. But you wonder why he suggested three shelters. I mean, why pick out that particular activity to do? And again, if you're thinking as a Jew, then there might be some connections here to Jewish worship, because the Greek word here is skene, S-K-E-N-E. And this word can be translated as a tent or a booth or a hut, okay? But it's also the word that's used for tabernacle. And the tabernacle, you remember, is the tent of witness, which was a place of worship for the Jews, and it was a place in which God came down and dwelt among his people on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, symbolically, and also in the cloud and in the fire, in a sense. And so you wonder if Peter is trying to make this place a place of worship, and that he would want to, worship in different ways, Jesus and Moses and Elijah. But then you see that while Peter's talking about that, that's when the cloud shows up. And then after God proclaims what he says about Jesus, and then the cloud kind of disappears, then Jesus is alone. And so you wonder if that's maybe not God's answer to Peter, saying, okay, you want to honor all three, but let me tell you who is the most important one of the three. Let me just make that really clear. So that's another interesting point out of this. And then you have what God said from the cloud in verse 35, says, this is my son whom I have chosen, listen to him. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say, listen to him, to Jesus. And this is a way of confirming that the ministry of Christ and his authority are greater than Moses or Elijah. Now, if you stop just for a minute and you think about what that means for a Jew, if Jews would have made a Mount Rushmore, so to speak, then probably Moses and Elijah would have been two of the people on Mount Rushmore, because Moses was the one that led them out of slavery, and then he received the law on Mount Sinai. He led them through the wilderness, and so Moses represented that freedom and also the law. And so when you said Moses, you thought law. And of course, for the Jews, the law is core for their lives. They're supposed to memorize it, think about it, teach it all the time. And so when you say Moses, then the Jews have him as one of their main heroes. And then you go to the time of the prophets. And of course, all through their history, God sent his servants, the prophets. But Elijah was one of the most amazing ones. There are a lot of miracle stories told about Elijah, all the things that he did. He also was a prophet in a place and time of great opposition. He thought at one point he was the only servant of the Lord left in the whole country. And although God corrected that, you can understand why he thought that, because in 1 Kings, he has the battle with the prophets of Baal, and it's him against everybody else, including Ahab and Jezebel. And so Elijah is another amazing representative of the Jews whom they held in high esteem. And so when you have Jesus appearing with Moses and Elijah, you have three of the most important figures of history. And so the Jews know about Moses and Elijah, but a Jew reading this story or hearing this story might not know as much about Jesus. And if he knew about him, he might not be convinced about Jesus. He probably wouldn't have put Jesus equal or higher to Moses and Elijah. And so for God to come and to say this, that, you see these three, but I want you to listen to Jesus. He's saying, look, my son is more important than the law and the prophets. It's not that they don't matter, but both the law and the prophets pointed to Jesus. And so the law and the prophets themselves said Jesus is more important. And then God affirms it here on this mountain. And so this is a powerful testimony for the Jews that are hearing or reading this story. And it's one that would take them a while to get used to because they're not convinced about it necessarily. Good. The next point, people have studied this story and then tried to compare it with Moses going up to Mount Sinai. Since we have Moses in this story, as a Jew, you're already thinking about Moses and all that he did. And so when you have Mark's version of the story in particular, you have a number of similarities. For example, you have a mention of 6 days, both in Mark 9 and in Exodus 24. You have a mention of 3 disciples that accompany Moses or that accompany Jesus as this event happens. Then you have them going up on a mountain, obviously Mount Sinai, and then in this case, this mountain, whether it's Hermon or Tabor. And then in both cases, you have some kind of a transfiguration. You have Moses that goes up, receives the law, stays in the presence of God, comes down, and his face is shining so much he has to put a veil over his face because the Israelites can't stand to look at him with how bright his face is. And then here also you have Jesus transfigured and maybe even better said, revealed for who he really is. Then also in both cases, in these verses, there's a cloud that appears at Mount Sinai and here. In both cases, there's a voice in the cloud. And then in both cases, there's fear in the people that are watching. And so if you look at this, kind of interesting, 7 similarities between these two stories. And so, again, that's a pretty strong connection, just again, emphasizing how interconnected this story is with different parts of the Bible. Now, that's Moses. And then you turn around and look at Elijah. And if you look at the later part of this story, and if you look at actually other versions of it, not just the Luke version, they're asking him about Elijah. And later on, Jesus is going to say, Elijah has come. And if you can accept it, it was John the Baptist. So you think about, okay, when did Elijah come, first of all? Okay, first, he came in the Old Testament when he was actually on the earth living for the first time, all the way from 1 Kings 17 all the way through 2 Kings 2. Then he was taken up in the chariot of fire and didn't die. Okay, so it's interesting that in this story, you also have 2 connections with people that didn't die, Enoch and Elijah, the only 2 people in history that didn't die, and they're both connected to this story. Just again, another connection there. And then Malachi 4:5 mentions, I will send the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord. And so again, it's a setup telling the Jews, here's what you can expect. First of all, Elijah is going to come back, and then the Messiah will come. All right. Then you have in Matthew 11:14, in Matthew 17:12, that's the other version of the Transfiguration, and then in Luke 1:17, you have John the Baptist in all three of those passages being connected with Elijah. Okay, and the Matthew 17 version is actually where Jesus himself mentions Elijah as John the Baptist, or John the Baptist as Elijah. And then, of course, you have Elijah appearing in this story in Matthew 17 and in Luke 9 as well. And so, again, just like Moses is all over this story and connected to the Exodus, then Elijah is all over this story and connected to Old and perhaps even the New Testament along with Moses, which takes us to our next point in the story, which is the connection between Matthew 17 or Luke 9 and Revelation 11, verses 3 through 12. And so I invite you to go over to Revelation with me, last book in the New Testament, chapter 11, beginning in verse 3. And so it says, I will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. They are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone tries to harm them, fire comes from their mouths and devours their enemies. This is how anyone who wants to harm them must die. They have power to shut up the heavens so that it will not rain during the time they are prophesying, and they have the power to turn the waters into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. Now, when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will attack them and overpower and kill them. Their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, some from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies and refuse them burial. The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending each other gifts, because these 2 prophets had tormented those who live on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them. Interesting change of tense there. Now it's past tense. And they stood on their feet, and terror struck those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, Come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies looked on. Now, as we read through that, did you notice any similarities with this story in Revelation and the characters of Matthew 17 or Luke 9? I think probably, if you know anything about the Bible at all, you saw several connections there. First of all, in this passage, the 2 witnesses that are there are connected to 2 olive trees, okay? And in the Old Testament, the olive tree often represented the nation of Israel, like in Hosea 14:6 or Jeremiah 11:16. And in Zechariah chapter 4, verses 11 through 14, there's 2 olive trees on each side of the lampstand, and they represent the 2 that are anointed to serve the Lord. That's in Zechariah, okay? So you have a reference to the Old Testament there and the olive trees. And then you have the 2 candlesticks mentioned also. And in the New Testament, you have a reference in Revelation 1:20, in this immediate context, the same book. The candlesticks represent the church. And so you have the people of God represented by the trees and by the candlesticks, Old and New Testament, the people of God from all time. And then if you look down at verse 6 again, it says that the witnesses have power to do certain things while they're still prophesying and teaching there. One, they have the power to close the heavens so that it doesn't rain. Now, who does that sound like? That's exactly like the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 17 and 18, when because the people are so unfaithful, then Elijah prays to God and it didn't rain for 3 years, okay? They also have the power, the witnesses do, to change water into blood. Now, who does that sound like? Obviously, that's Moses. That's one of the signs that he was given to do in Egypt. Okay? And it says they also have power to unleash all kinds of plagues on the earth. And again, you think Moses, the plagues, Exodus 7, really 7 through 12, all of those chapters. And so, again, you have connections to Revelation 11 and to Moses and Elijah and this story back in Matthew 17. Then in verses 8 through 10, the Revelation passage talks about the two witnesses being killed in Jerusalem. And where is Jesus killed? It's in Jerusalem as well. And then in verse 11, it says the witnesses are resurrected after 3.5 days and taken up into heaven in a cloud. And you think Jesus resurrected after 3 days, taken up into heaven in a cloud, although his ascension was about 40 days later. And so again, you have connections. You have Elijah also taken up to heaven, the chariot of fire, and then of course Christ in the ascension in Luke 24 and Acts 1. Okay, so there's just a number of connections. I don't know exactly, how tightly all that ties together, but for a Jew, they would notice all of those connections to the Old Testament, to the New Testament, and then also to this story in Matthew 17. So I think that's very intriguing. But perhaps none of those lessons or points are as intriguing as what happens when God speaks from heaven next. Now, in the story right before this, in Matthew 16, and also earlier in Luke chapter 9, then it's the story of the confession of Peter. And Jesus is asked, now, who do people say that I am? And then, who do you say that I am? And then Peter makes his famous confession. So, in chapter 16 of Matthew, the people have had their turn to say who they think Jesus is. Now, in Matthew 17, then God has his turn to say who Jesus is. And that's what happens when God speaks from heaven here, okay? And he does this, God does this, by a series of 3 remez. Now, if you remember what we talked about with remez back in the ways that the rabbis used to teach, a remez is a hint or a clue, an allusion to something else. And in the case of a remez, Jesus, or whoever was using it, would say like a piece of an idea or a piece of a scripture, a passage, and then the people to whom he's speaking would understand the rest of the context from the piece of the passage that he quoted. And then they would get the lesson that that Jesus is trying to say. Sometimes they would get it, and the readers like us that don't have the Old Testament memorized, we just don't get it. This flies right over our head. And so God uses 3 remezes here in this one statement, okay? So if you go back to Luke 9:35, it says, this is my son, whom I have chosen, listen to him. 3 parts to what God said here, okay? Now, let's do a little test here and see how much of the Old Testament you know, or if any of this sounds familiar to you from the Old Testament. First of all, let's start with, this is my son. What does that remind you of? Okay, you can pause the video if you want to. Think about that for a minute, but try to find out where that phrase would come from as a Jew would hear it. Okay? If you go back to the Old Testament and you have Psalms, go to Psalm 2, and in verse 7, here's what it says. It says, I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Now, in the context of Psalm 2, it could have to do with the king, as the king is considered God's son and God is father. But Psalm 2 is also widely considered a messianic prophecy, right? And so God is saying, a remez, this is my son, and a Jew would pick up on that and think, Psalm 2, that means that he's saying he's the Messiah, okay? It's not just David he's talking about. He's talking about the King of Kings, the Messiah, okay? And then you have the phrase, whom I have chosen. Okay, again, think about what would the Jews hear when they heard that phrase. And again, if you want to pause this, you can. Now, if you've had time to think about that, go with me now to Isaiah chapter 42. Isaiah chapter 42, verse 1, and it says, "Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations." And this is a passage that's already been quoted, really, in the Gospels before. And so, again, a Jew would hear, "whom I have chosen," and think, my chosen one, that's also part of a messianic prophecy. And so that would be two things that they've just heard God hint at, that maybe Jesus is the Messiah. And then if you see the last part, "listen to him," besides pointing to Jesus as more important than Moses or Elijah, that's another clue that a Jew would hear, an echo of another Old Testament passage. And so again, if you want to pause it, think about it, look it up, then you can do that. And if you've come back now, then go to Deuteronomy chapter 18. Deuteronomy 18. And in this passage, it's talking about the future people who are going to serve God. It's talking about the kings that are going to come and how they need to follow the law and all these things. And so if you go to Deuteronomy 18:15, it says this: "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him." Okay? And so again, the Jews that hear that say, okay, so now he's talking about a prophet. This is also a messianic hint as well. And so here you have three different parts of this statement God says from heaven. You have three different references to the Old Testament, and all three refer to Jesus as the Messiah. Now let me show you something even a little bit cooler, okay? The word in Hebrew for what we call the Old Testament is Tanakh. And in Hebrew, they would put the vowels underneath the line in vowel pointing. They just have the consonants in the original Hebrew. And so that word, Tanakh, in the Old Testament, the original Hebrew would just be TNK, okay? And it's basically that word because it's an acrostic that reminds the Jews of the three sections of the Old Testament, okay? So for example, you have the Torah, the T, okay, and that is the law. And so the reference that came about the prophet is from the section of the law in Deuteronomy. And then the N stands for Navim, or prophets. And so the deal about my chosen one comes from the Navim, from the prophets. And then the K stands for Ketuvim, and that is the writings, in Hebrew, the writings. And that's where the passage from Psalm 2, "This is my son," comes from, okay? And so what God does here in this Remez, when he speaks to the people, to Peter, James, and John, he says he basically includes one Remez from each section of the Old Testament, each of the three sections that are the main sections, Torah, Navim, and Ketuvim. And in effect, what God is saying is, I testify, and all the scriptures, all parts of the scriptures testify that Jesus is my son. He is the Messiah, and he's the one to whom all should listen. Now, that's pretty cool, right? I never thought about all of that. I had to learn that from other people. But that's just amazing how much is in this one short story that's so crucial. And so I think you can see what I meant when I said at the beginning, I'm so excited about studying and learning all this. And also I realize what an important story this is and how connected it is to the rest of the Bible. And so you have the Transfiguration story looking back to the Old Testament, and you can see how Jesus fulfills the promises of God, the law itself, the prophecies there, and the messianic prophecies from the prophets. So all of the Old Testament points toward Jesus, and that connects with this Transfiguration. And Jesus then is called superior to them, to the Old Testament, to Moses, to Elijah, the law, the prophets. And yet, this story of the Transfiguration also looks forward because it talks about his exodus. Those are the events of the cross and the resurrection, and then his ascension and return. You look forward even all the way into Revelation, and the story about the two witnesses is also connected with this one. And you have the idea of the Son of Man coming on the clouds in glory, just another messianic reference as well. And then finally, just as kind of like the final nail that really nails everything down, it confirms without doubt God's witness about his Son's identity. And so just a fabulous story with a lot in it. One of those stories where you need to go back over a number of times and really think about all of it and how it connects. Hope this has been helpful to you. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.